The next part of the First Amendment we're going to focus on is the part that protects your right to freedom of speech, and sort of related, the part that relates to freedom of press. So again, that's the entire text of the First Amendment. We've already talked about the religious aspect, which is like the first clause, and you can see shortly after that, or abridging the freedom of speech, is what we refer to as the freedom of speech clause, right? So that's the part of the First Amendment that guarantees this basic right that you have as an American citizen. All right, so it's important to note that there are two different types of speech that the First Amendment pertains to. The first part is the part that I think would be what we most think about when we think about free speech. Is it's your ability actually to engage in like the spoken word. So to say that like you favor a politician or you oppose something the government's doing, that's like spoken speech. Like you give a speech or you're having a conversation, those things would be like pure speech, right? Or even if you were to write that down, right, that would be considered pure speech. But the First Amendment, through Supreme Court rulings, also protects things like symbolic speech, where you're not actually saying things, but you're engaging in some sort of action or demonstration that's expressing your views. The best example of that is burning a flag. It's a very controversial thing, but the Supreme Court in the 1980s basically ruled that people have a right to engage in flag burning, that's expression, it's political expression, and that's covered by First Amendment and free speech. So again, free speech is both pure speech, which is spoken speech, and then symbolic speech. Obviously, like all of the amendments and parts of the amendments, the free speech amendment is not like an absolute right. There are obviously restrictions on it, and many of them are like common sense based. So, any kind of speech, whether it's pure or symbolic, that advocates or encourages any kind of violence is not protected. So again, like the cliche example is if you are watching a movie and you're bored by the movie and you decide to entertain yourself by just screaming fire at the top of your lungs, and people are like stampeding each other like on the way out of the movie theater to escape what they think is a fire, like you can't claim that that's free speech, right? That you're putting other people in danger. Or if you advocate violence against a politician or another group of people, that's not protected, right? The other things that aren't protected would be things like libel and slander. So libel and slander are very similar, right? Libel is things that you write about somebody else. So libel is written. You're writing about somebody else, and you knowingly are writing something that's false and is being written to intentionally hurt somebody's character or just their reputation. And slander is the same thing, except it's spoken speech. So that you're actually speaking, like you go on TV and you knowingly make something up or you say something that's false, in an attempt to intentionally damage somebody's character. Libel and slander are also not protected forms of like free speech. It also has to be understood that it's very difficult to prove libel and slander in court. And for most celebrities and politicians, like they're not willing to go through the long legal process to try and prove that somebody else libeled or slandered them. Every once in a while, you see a pretty high profile case involving that, but it's not very often. And then the second part of like this video focuses on the freedom of the press. Obviously, we know that in the United States, the press is largely independent of our government. There are some rules that the press has to follow, but like they're not the same as the government. The government doesn't control the press. If you just look at the map here, it's put together by one organization called Reporters Without Borders that tries to like get a sense for like how free the press is within those countries. You can basically see that countries in the white have the most open press. Countries in the yellow still have a significant amount of freedom of press within it. And as we get into like the reds, the oranges, the reds, and the blacks, they are the countries that have very little freedom of the press. The government has a lot more regulation over what the press can cover. Um, so one of the things we need to talk about when we talk about with freedom of press, because this comes up every once in a while on the AP test, is the vocab term prior restraint. So prior restraint is when an individual is able, or like the government, is able to stop something from being printed or said like ahead of time. So, for example, let's say that there is a politician that knows that some newspaper is about ready to publish a big story that's going to expose like corruption that that politician is involved in. Um, if the politician were to be able to go to a court and the court would issue an order that would prevent that newspaper from publishing it, that would be called prior restraint. You're actually restraining the speech before it occurs, hence the term prior restraints. It is like super, super rare that a court in the United States would grant prior restraints. Usually, the courts will allow the person to say what they need to say or publish the article they need to publish, and then the individual that's the target of that speech can file some sort of like lawsuit. Um, but for the court to actually stop the speech from occurring ahead of time is very rare. Really, the only cases we would have of that occurring in American history would be if like national security is at risk. If by something being published or said you are putting the country at risk, then maybe the court would consider erring on the side of caution and preventing that speech. But that's super rare in this country. Much more common in the countries that you see like in the black and in the red.